very warm welcome to all the viewers and everyone who is joining us at this time of the evening. This is a very special occasion because we are here today launching and discussing a very special book, A Full Spectrum, India's Wars Covering 1972 to 2020 by Arjun Subramaniam, a retired Air Vice Marshal for Indian Air Force. He wears multiple hats, an accomplished fighter pilot, and after retirement, a very prolific writer, an academic, as well as India's foremost strategic minds at the moment. So this book is a sequel of his equally well-received first volume, India's Wars, Military History, 1947 to 1971. So I have the pleasure of having the author with me. I have the pleasure of having two very distinguished discussants with me. Sandeep Unnithan, Executive Editor, India Today, and Dr. Christina Gulter from King's College, London, both of whom will be commenting on the book after the initial remarks by the author. A very few, just before we start the official proceedings, let me also mention the fact that you are free to send in your questions, comments, and observations throughout this discussion. We'll be very happy to take them forward as we proceed with our discussion in the second half of this event. In India, military history as a discipline has not really evolved. We have not been able to produce great scholarship on the subject so far. In fact, most of international relations departments in India don't teach military history as part of their curriculum. Let's forget about India's Department of History. So if you look at the academic evolution of the subject, we face a problem. And it is beginning to change now, and I think Arjun's multiple works are going to be pioneering in that regard. But this book is not simply an interrogation into India's military past, but it is also a policy critique in some ways of Indian strategic evolution. It highlights internal and external security challenges that India has faced as a nation state, that Indian armed forces have faced as a professional unit, and it underscores at times when Indian decision makers have failed to leverage the tactical and operational advantages on the ground for larger strategic gains. And that's a theme that runs through this volume, which I think is in some way a very important lesson to be learned for many in the policymaking establishment. So the terrain that this book covers is vast. The issues that it tackles are complex, and the questions that it raises are equally profound. So without further ado, I'll let the author speak about the book, about what he says in the book, and what are the issues and questions that he wants to raise in the public policy space with this book. With this, Arjun, floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Harsh, for those very gracious openings. Thank you, Sandeep and Professor Gulter for joining me this evening. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for tuning in. I'm not going to be talking to you much about the book, beyond flagging the fact that it deals with all genres of conflict that India's armed forces have engaged in since 1972. Full Spectrum is actually an attempt to bring military history to a full spectrum readership through a hybrid narrative that is devoid of too much of military jargon. Also called these days by many scholars, particularly in the United States, as applied military history. And why I say applied is because when you weave in the strategic, the operational, and the tactical together, along with offering policy lessons, that becomes actually applied military history. What Full Spectrum also does, it seeks to showcase the contribution of the Indian military in the growth of India as a flourishing and evolving democracy, and actually also as a growing power of consequence. Now, the book is divided into 22 chapters and is accompanied by several curated maps, which if you look at closely, you will realize that it flows with the narrative and is not just a series of rivers and formations all clubbed together. And almost 100 photographs, several from private collections that have not been seen before. Now, an author and his or her book are like conjoined twins. And I felt that I must share some part of my personal journey over the last 8 years to highlight some of the lessons that may emerge for younger scholars researchers, and those amongst you who have a passion yet to be realized. Now, it was 2012, and I was an upwardly mobile two-star officer, but was actually intellectually restless. I had finished my PhD, and I got a little tired of writing for the preceding 6 years and researching about air power, which had, to my mind at that stage in 2012, rather plateaued out. Military history was always my passion since I was a kid. And I suddenly realized that there was very little military history across the world written from a joint perspective, and none at all in India. So I sat down over a weekend and wrote out a detailed synopsis and sent it to Admiral Arun Prakash. Now, Admiral Arun Prakash told me that, look, if you want the book to be read widely, you need to actually send it to two professional historians who would give you their sense of whether there is, whether there is value in it. So off I sent a synopsis to two world-renowned historians, one of them including Professor Sugata Bose from Harvard, the grandnephew of Subhash Chandra Bose. Well, I was very surprised that I got a thumbs up from both of them a couple of months later, and I was all set to go. Now, India's wars was a shot in the dark, honestly. That hit the target. And I realized that I needed to maintain the momentum and started writing the sequel. Now, I didn't realize that Full Spectrum would be so difficult to write. And there are a couple of reasons that I wanted to share with you. The first was the complete absence of classical archival materials and primary sources comprising of declassified files, reports, and memos that military historians dig deep into to get their stuff all over the world. Unfortunately, there's none of that here in India. As a result, my main resources have been interviews and personal papers, and I use the time-tested methodology of triangulation to arrive at the most probable sequence of events and outcomes, and to reduce the amount of subjectivity that could normally creep into such narratives. For example, nowhere in the IAF records is there any mention of MiG-23s, MiG-25s, and Canberra bomber-cum reconnaissance aircraft carrying out several intrusive missions into the Northern Territories, particularly over Skardu. And I have written about that. The second was that the book was written under the immense pressure of a drastic career switch which completely disrupted the family and had us living out of suitcases for 18 months as I moved between Harvard, Oxford, Tufts, and then back to Delhi to complete the book while concurrently teaching at Ashoka and Jindal. The last and biggest challenge was to write fairly, fearlessly, and respectfully about events and accomplished professionals who you've seen from close quarters. Writing about successes and victories is the easiest part of writing military history. But objective military history is not only about guts and glory, it's about a lot more. But at the end of it all, I think it's been worth its while and worth the effort. And I hope that you as readers feel the same too. Now, with all humility, I would like to say that this book would not have been possible without the generosity of over 100 veterans and an equal number of serving officers from all the three services. We have amongst us this evening, hopefully all of them have tuned in, 5 veterans who feature in my book. And I will actually showcase a couple of vignettes from the book through the lens of their accomplishments. Now, the 5 of them in order of seniority are Admiral Madhavendra Singh, a former Chief of Naval Staff, Lieutenant General Prakash Katoch, a paratrooper and a former brigade commander of the Siachen Brigade, Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur, an accomplished test pilot and who also commanded the helicopter unit in Siachen, Lieutenant General Praveen Bakshi, whose last assignment was as the Army Commander of Eastern Army Command during the Doklam crisis, and Air Marshal Nambia, one of the most accomplished Mirage 2000 fighter pilots in the Indian Air Force, and somebody who has made his mark during the Kargil conflict. Now, I was indeed fortunate to get Admiral Madhavendra talk about his tenure as the first captain of INS Virat, the Indian Navy's second aircraft carrier, and an operation that is not very well known, which is called Operation Jupiter, which coincided with the withdrawal of the Indian peacekeeping force from Sri Lanka in mid-1989. And I will read a short paragraph from the book to highlight what he told me during our interviews. While the Indian Army readied an extra infantry division and its para brigade as part of a contingency plan to cover the withdrawal of the IPKF, the Indian Navy sailed the aircraft carrier INS Virat into the waters off the Kerala coast in mid-July 1989. Commanding the Virat was Captain Madhavendra Singh, a future Chief of Naval Staff. Recalling the momentous events that commenced with a brief order on 17th July to get to operational readiness and sail south, Madhavendra had 12 hours for steam. In naval parlance, that meant 12 hours to get to full operational readiness from his current position at anchorage, barely 2 miles off the Bombay Harbour. Now, it was only after a few days of workup off Cochin that Madhavendra was told, to his utter surprise, that he would have company on board. And that company was in the form of the 7th Battalion of the Garhwal Rifles, or 7 Garhwal. Madhavendra recalls that it was a good experience in planning and preparing for an out-of-area contingency operation, as the Virat and its Sea King and Cheetah crews spent quality training time with 7 Garhwal Rifles over almost 2 weeks, while they waited in international waters away from the gaze of the Sri Lankan Navy. Now, this is interesting. As the Gadwalis finally disembarked after the operation was called off, Captain Madhavendra heard the troops talking amongst themselves in Hindi, saying, "Are yaar, ye kamal ki cheez hai, ye to mini shehar hai," and translated, "This is a wonder, just like a mini city." Now, interestingly, Admiral Madhavendra was also the CNC of Western Naval Command during the Kargil conflict, and spoke to me with great humility about the modest but important role of the Indian Navy in keeping the Pakistanis and the Americans guessing about Indian intentions should it open multiple fronts. Now, it's extremely difficult to keep the Maroon Berets away from almost every narrative that I've written in the book. And my next protagonist is Lieutenant General Prakash Katoch, who features extensively in several narratives, including Operation Blue Star. But I've chosen the one from his command of the Siachen Brigade during a time when the Kargil conflict was concurrently raging to the west. Now, the capture of Point 5770, which was a daunting task in the southern glacier, is easily amongst the 2 or 3 most difficult and successful high-altitude assault operations conducted by the Indian Army. And I'll read a bit from that. 13 years after he was wounded during Operation Blue Star, Lieutenant General Prakash Katoch found himself commanding the Siachen Brigade at a time when the northern and central sectors were relatively stable. The action had shifted to the southern and the Chorbatla sectors. Soon it became clear to Katoch that Point 5770 stood like a sentinel in the area, and should the Pakistanis creep up to the top, they would be able to dominate several Indian posts and logistics routes by directing effective fire onto the area. Throughout 1998, the Indians made concerted attempts to reach Point 5770, but failed because of the physical challenges posed by the terrain and the weather. Now, this is fast forwarding a few months ago, when a couple of battalions of his, with a task force that was assembled, assaulted Point 5770. This galvanized Katoch into action, and he decided that the only option to surprise the enemy was a vertical assault during the summer from the east with a small team. After speedy approval for an assault from the divisional headquarters, Katoch and K.H. Singh, who was commanding one of the major battalions in the southern glacier, put together a crack assault team comprising of 3 accomplished mountaineer soldiers. Now, their instructions were clear: launch a vertical assault in broad daylight from the east, where the enemy would least expected from. The assault team climbed for 7 hours in full combat gear, carrying AK-47s and carbines. They reached the post at 2 p.m. and took the defenders by surprise. Now, Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur is a pioneer himself on the Siachen Glacier. He's among the first pilots to land on the glacier way back in 1978. And I again turn to the Siachen narrative from a helicopter's perspective. And now, for a change, instead of the narrative, let me explain to you that at that particular time, Flying Officer Manmohan Bahadur, as he was posted to 114 helicopter unit, which was then in Jammu. And he was a co-pilot to 3 captains over several weeks as they supported a mission that was traversing across the glacier and climbing the peaks around the glacier, led by India's legendary mountaineer by the name of Colonel Colonel Narendra Kumar. Now, for those of you who have not seen the glacier either through photographs or on a film, it is one long expanse of menacing snow, which is flanked by even more menacing mountains. And this casualty evacuation operation that I featured in the book, which had Bahadur as one of the pilots, had to extend right to the northern tip of the glacier, very, very close to our Abim, this pass which is called Siala Pass, and just below Indira Kol, where they had to evacuate one of the mountaineers back to Thois. Now, these are the kind of stories that emerge from the Siachen Glacier. Now on to my next protagonist from the book. I first met Lieutenant General Praveen Bakshi when he was a Major General in charge of operations in Southern Command. And he capped his very, very illustrious career as the Army Commander or the Commander-in-Chief of Eastern Army Command, which actually looks after operations in the entire Eastern Theatre, wherein a large portion of the line of actual control runs, and where there was trouble in Doklam. Lieutenant General Praveen Bakshi, the Eastern Army Commander at the time, understood Chinese articulation and posturing in that area. A Chinese general, Zhao Zhongqi, visited Kolkata in December 2016 to meet Bakshi. There was much bonhomie, but also an element of sizing one another up. The first signs of Chinese intent emerged towards the end of May 2017, when the PLA asked the Indian Army to demolish 2 old unoccupied bunkers located on the Indian side of the border near the Dolam Plateau. The Indians did not comply. The PLA waited for a week and then demolished a bunker on June 8th, warning that they would destroy the second one too, or demolish the second one too. This is when the Corps Commander alerted Bakshi. Bakshi sought authorization from Army headquarters to sort of cross the line of actual control into Bhutanese territory in order to preempt the Chinese move further forward towards the Jampheri Ridge, which is actually a strategically positioned ridge that would have given the Chinese a look into the Chumbi Valley, and there was no way in which the Indian Army was going to allow that. Defending the stretch of the line of actual control was a brigade which was commanded by Brigadier Gambhir Singh, whose men crossed the border immediately and ordered the PLA to halt all construction activity. Now Gambhir set up a continuous blocking position with Bakshi and the Corps Commander Jha in constant touch on the plateau in front of the construction equipment. Initially, Gambhir had 250 men, but soon this number increased to 450. The men were replaced every 2 hours because of weather conditions. The Indian troops were fully acclimatized, which greatly facilitated the task. And in the meantime, Bakshi ordered a media ban, which actually allowed us to stay ahead of the curve. Now, just as you can't keep the Maroon Berets away from the action, so has it been for the Mirage 2000 fleet. Now, the Mirages have been in action since 1987 in several less than war and limited conflict situations. They were over Jaffna during Operation Pumalai at the beginning of the Indian peace, prior to the Indian peacekeeping force going over there. They escorted the IL-76 for some way while they were on their way to the Maldives, and they were very, very active during the Kargil conflict, where I believe that they proved to be the turning point as far as air operations was concerned in terms of impacting overall operations. And finally, they were at the forefront of the Balakot strikes early last year. Okay. Now, Air Marshal Nambia recently retired as the Commander-in-Chief of Western Air Command. He's a contemporary of mine, is one of our most accomplished test pilots, and probably amongst the 2 or 3 most accomplished Mirage 2000 pilots since 1987, having flown, again, amongst the maximum number of hours on the aircraft. And also, to his credit, is that he was responsible for dropping, if I'm not wrong, 5 of the 8 LGBs that were dropped during the Kargil conflict. Now, the most impactful strike that Nambia was involved in was over Tiger Hill, and I will just read a paragraph. From 23rd June onwards, Mirages targeted key nodes and bunkers on Tiger Hill that had been clearly located. The first mission with Wing Commander Nambiar and Flight Lieutenant Monish was hampered by clouds that obscured the lightning pod's field of view. Now, the lightning pod is a targeting pod that was acquired from Israel just in time to be used in the Kargil conflict. However, over the next 2 days, despite bad weather which made them abandon to abort the first mission, they managed direct hits on bunkers and a communication node. Images of enemy soldiers running was captured by the lightning pods. An Aviation Research Center long-range photography mission, or a LoRaP mission, followed by a MiG-25 reconnaissance, located a hangar-like structure that was located, to the west and behind Tiger Hill. Which it was actually a logistics node and probably a heliport. Between 5th and 9th July, Nambiar and Flight Lieutenant Tokekar were again in the thick of action as Mirage 2000s from 7th Squadron flew 2 missions that destroyed the hangar and then carried out a reconnaissance mission to check the damage. Now, so the book has several such anecdotes. And it is through these lenses that the book unfolds across this vast landscape. Before I end, once again, I'd like to thank Harsh and ORF and to Sandeep and Christina for agreeing to be part of this. And last but not the least, I'd like to thank my wife Mautika and my daughter Shruti and Meghna, who demonstrated tremendous amount of patience and supported me through these long years. Particularly as I frequently faded away from everything. With that, I come to the end of my short, I hope it was short, presentation. It's over to you, Harsh, Sandeep, and Christina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arjun. What a lovely way to expound on the book by presenting these vignettes. We wish we had more time for more of these. But let me go to Christina now. Dr. Christina Gulter teaches at King's College London. She's an air power expert, and she has written on Indian air power in the past, some of India's major conflicts and the role that air power has played in particular. So we look forward to hearing from you, Christina.
Good. Well, thank you, Harsh, very much for your very generous invitation. I was delighted when I received this invitation, and so delighted to see the publication of the Air Vice Marshal's book, because one of the observations I made a few years ago in that article in the Indo-Pacific Affairs Journal was that Anglo-American air power studies seem to have concentrated very narrowly on the world wars, maybe Vietnam, and regional conflicts involving NATO partners. And with the exception of, 2 highly regarded air power scholars, not least Ben Lambeth, the American, and Air Vice Marshal Tony Mason, I think Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American scholarship has been painfully ignorant about India's experiences, and the fact that the Indian Air Force is one of the oldest independent air forces in the world, dating back to the early 1930s. I think this just sails over people's heads. I made the point in that article that in the conceptual domain, I think the Indian air power doctrine was way ahead of much of what appears in sort of American or British equivalents. And looking at the 2012 IAF doctrine, I was intrigued to find out what had prompted the revision in a lot of India's thinking. And I was very grateful to Harsh for inviting me to look at that. I think it's fascinating to see the way that India has responded to the shift in the balance of power, particularly in the Far East, and some of the wider challenges in the international security environment. And I think my observation was that India has changed from a largely regional perspective to one of being more global influence and power projection. And this has had ramifications for all the services, not just the Indian Air Force, but we've seen the Indian Air Force, I think, transforming itself from a principally army support mechanism to being a broad spectrum Air Force with strategic reach and conventional deterrence. In this article, I argued that this development reflected a new security environment, but it was also prompted by experience over the last few decades, not least the Kargil conflict of '99. And I think, and this is the frustration that I had, I realized because the Kosovo campaign was happening at the same time, it meant that the British and American perspective was focused very heavily on that conflict. The fact that Kargil was happening at the same time completely bypassed most audiences. And indeed, I think there's very little understanding of the fact that India has had to face at least 5 separate high-intensity conflicts in the border regions, not least the 1962 conflict with China. But what's so fascinating about that this is the only conflict that India lost, but it was also the only conflict where air power wasn't employed. So in every other instance, India has managed to turn the tide with, the assistance of air power. What I argued was that the Kargil was instrumental in a reworking of Indian air power doctrine, and also the way in which intelligence is thought about, particularly integrated into joint planning. I think it represented a sea change in India's posture from being reactive and having nuclear deterrence to a far greater consideration of what conventional deterrence and power projection are about. And I think it's one of the ironies of India's nuclear deterrence that other potentially hostile nations recognize that India has a no first use policy for nuclear weapons and has been very, very careful about not escalating conflicts in the region. But what this means is that India, I think, had downsized a lot of its conventional capability, and this merely emboldened, potentially hostile states. So in short, if you want to have a credible nuclear deterrent, you have to make sure that your conventional capability is also a sufficient deterrent. However, I think since Kargil, India has rethought the conventional capabilities and specifically seeing air power as a strategic instrument and also being decisive in its own right. I won't belabor the details of Kargil because this audience knows it only too well, but I found it fascinating to see the way in which it led to a reformation of the intelligence apparatus. Many writers on the Kargil period see it as a systemic intelligence failure, but I think that does a disservice to the parts of the Indian intelligence apparatus that actually work very well, and particularly the Joint Intelligence Committee, which was responsible for those pan-government assessments, did raise the possibility of potential Pakistani campaign in the Kargil zone in 1998 in November, some 5 months before the incursion. And the JIC also pointed to an emboldened Pakistani government. But I think the problem with so many strategic level pan-government assessments like that is that assessments done by committee very often use anodyne and watered down language, so that, you know, perhaps that intelligence assessment lacked the punch that it really needed to. I think also what the Cargill report pointed to even more critically is the fault in jointry, specifically the lack of communication and discourse between air and land headquarters at the time. Valuable time was lost due to there being no formal air-land integration mechanisms. And this issue of jointry, I think, received a lot of very, very important attention in the Indian Air Force doctrine. And this is what I picked up on. The Indian Air Force doctrine of 2012 used the term jointmanship. And I thought that that was tremendous, because what in essence it was doing was to make jointry a function of leadership. And this is way ahead of what appears in Anglo-American doctrine. But there's also a point in the 2012 doctrine about how the services need to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each other. In other words, you know, getting in the boots of your opposite number, but really fundamentally understanding what each other is about. And again, that is lacking in so much of Western air power doctrine. And I think the 2012 doctrine also had some unique features in relation to maritime air operations, which again, I think represented a significant advance on what we see, particularly in Anglo-American doctrine. So, you know, to conclude, I think it's very clear from 2012 doctrine that the IAF was seeing itself increasingly as an instrument of power projection and underpinning expeditionary capability, but also crucially that it's the principal instrument in India's armory if nuclear deterrence fails. And I think one of the overriding lessons from the 99 Cargill experience was that India recognized that it paid a very heavy price for a failure to invest properly in conventional deterrence, a balanced force structure and intelligence, but that it was air power that had been the main factor in turning the tide in that conflict. And the transformation which the IAF has undergone has ensured new and strong international partnerships, which in turn have added to the deterrent value of the Indian Air Force. And I was so delighted when I saw what the Air Vice Marshal had written. And I think what the Full Spectrum book does is to underline the importance of not over-compartmentalizing the strategic contexts in which we find ourselves, because as he says in the book, you know, we shouldn't lose sight of big state threats, and they're becoming, as he said, back en vogue, and quite rightly so, but also the fact that, you know, we're very unlikely to see regional and sort of sub-regional conflicts going away. These things will be a constant feature. So I think, you know, the Air Vice Marshal's book is tremendous because it's an aid memoir for us to not make those absolutist positions that, you know, just because we've, you know, had Iraq and Afghanistan, that we need to move away from, you know, counterinsurgency and just focus on the big state threats. I keep saying this to my students. There's only been 1 year since the end of the Second World War when Britain hasn't been involved in some sort of counterinsurgency type of campaign. There have been over 72 recognized cases of counterinsurgency since the end of the Second World War. So to flag this, I think, is tremendous. So I said this to the Air Vice Marshal before we started. I think it's a tremendous book, and I will make sure that within the UK air power world that this is appreciated and read, and this is going to be one of the first things that I throw at my students when it's published. So thank you both, Harsh and Air Marshal, for this invitation. I'm just delighted to be part of this forum. It's given me a real oomph in a sort of very dark period. Thank you, Harsh.
Thank you, Christine. And I'm sure Arjun would welcome the possibility of this book becoming a bestseller even in Britain. I think it's already a bestseller here in India. So Sandeep, over to you for your observations on the book, and on Arjun, of course, if you want to go there.
Thanks, Harsh. Arjun, sir, thanks very much for having me here. Dr. Christina, it was great listening to you. And I was telling my friends that there were two sequels by air warriors that we were really looking forward to in 2020. The first, of course, is Air Vice Marshal Subramaniam's book, and the second, of course, is Top Gun. Now, that has been postponed, I believe, to next year, but we'll have to wait for it. But it so happens that today is the 58th anniversary of the start of the India-China border war in 1962. So I'm not sure if Arjun sir chose this day to, launch his book. It's very appropriately timed because this was the one war that offensive air power was kept out of, where it could have really made a difference and turned the tide even. It was kept out of the game, and that is something that is debated till present day and will continue to do so in the future. My big observations about the book are, one, it's a magnificent work simply because, as Harsh mentioned, that books on military history in India are so rare, they're so few and far between. It's either individual accounts or they're episodic, because generally we in India seem to think of history as being a political narrative, and we have more books on political histories than books like India's Wars and indeed its sequel. So that is the void that these two books, and they should be read together. That's the void that these two books essentially fill. And the larger, the backdrop I see both these books play out on is the fact that we are in a very unique situation here in the Indian subcontinent, which is it's only one of two places in the world where it's a tri-junction between three nuclear weapon states. The other one is, of course, North Korea, Russia, and China. And here you have India, China, and Pakistan, three entirely different countries in terms of one is a democracy, the other is a democracy, but where the military has a say. It's been really the most important institution in Pakistan since the 50s. And of course, China, which is run by the Communist Party of China. And essentially the military history of the subcontinent, as is beautifully brought out in these two books, is the interplay between these three countries. It's a triangle of hate, if you can call it that. It's these three countries diametrically opposite to each other. Two have, of course, been collusively linked since the 1960s. So essentially the history of India and the military history of India is actually driven by the relationships between these three countries. And that's one of the biggest takeaways for me when I read the book. And the other aspect, of course, is the fact that we are possibly witnessing one of the world's longest covert wars. I'd be happy to be corrected on this, but I believe that the covert wars that India has been at the receiving end of began in 1947 with the raiders invading Jammu and Kashmir, when Pakistan armed, trained, and organized the tribal raiders to alter the situation as it existed in Jammu and Kashmir, and led to the first India-Pakistan war subsequently. And that was the beginning of a covert war that has continued almost without respite. Since 1947, it occasionally flares up into a full-scale shooting war. But the covert character, the insurgency aspect of this continues. In terms, you have 1965, where you have non-state actors, state actors, commandos pretending to be non-state actors. 1971, which is possibly the only time that India has turned the tables on Pakistan on a very large scale by training the Mukti Bahini in East Pakistan, and that leads to the creation of Bangladesh. Then you have the 2Ks of the 1980s. So the Pakistan Army has the 2K plan, which is to arm, train, and fund the Khalistani separatists, and then later you have the Kashmir insurgency, which begins in the early 90s, and that continues. And with liberalization, you have yet another phase of this covert war, which is the targeting of India's growth engines, the cities. You have this wave of urban terror that starts off in the 90s. One city in particular, Mumbai, is targeted 3 times over 15 years. You know the details, 93, 2006, 2008, all by the covert deep state of Pakistan. So this is a war that continues. Kargil also has a covert aspect to it in the sense that it's meant to be a denial operation, as in it's state actors pretending to be non-state actors, militants, and that continues. And all along you have a undercurrent of insurgency in the northeast. Now that is another aspect that the book brings out very clearly, the fact that this insurgency in the northeast, which begins in the 50s, it continues till present date. It's not resolved yet, but that also has the support of our neighbors, first Pakistan and then China. And Pakistan, when it loses, East Pakistan actually loses a base from which it can launch these guerrilla groups in the northeast, the Nagas and the Mizos and the Manipuris. So this covert war is one aspect that has been continuing without almost respite for the last 70 years. That's one very, very important aspect that this book brings out. And it's in fact a challenge to have written the second book. I can understand the first one, you're talking of wars which are fairly well documented. There are documents available for a lot of them. But the problem is when you start looking at the military operations, the military history post 1972. So in fact, one of my first questions to him was that how do you plan to do write about operations like Blue Star and the IPKF deployment in Sri Lanka, where there is literally no documentary, no documents, no primary sources for a military historian to look at. So this is a black hole as far as us in military writers is concerned. We have very little by way of official documents to go by. None of the documents have been declassified. And of course, all of you know that famous joke about the government of India's declassification policy, where there was a right to information request that was made a few years back asking about the government of India's declassification policy, and the response that the person got was that the declassification policy is itself classified. So that is the kind of wall that military historians like Arjun sir have to confront when you're writing about operations of the last 20 or 30 years. So it's remarkable what he has managed to achieve in interviewing a lot of the people who were who participated in these operations, who played key roles in that. Of course, there are very many others that we'd have really liked to hear from. General Sundarji for one, but he's also there in the book, and that's the fascinating part, that Arjun sir actually managed to meet him while he was in Wellington and got his perspective on those two very, very important operations that we don't really know about even till date. We don't know enough about, which is the IPKF deployment in Sri Lanka and the Operation Blue Star. And these are two operations that were highly critical, where the armies seem to have gone in without much preparation, not knowing about the end state that they were looking at. And it's also interesting the fact that we are actually talking about this. I'm going back to my earlier assertion about this triangle between India, Pakistan, and China that fuels the narrative. We are at the moment in the 6th month of a military standoff with China. In fact, the book very, very cleverly brings in the fact that it's like a fuse at the end of the book where it like leads into, I don't know, another chapter or maybe more pages in a reprint, a subsequent reprint. But the fact that 6 months later, we still don't know what the Chinese are doing on the LAC, as the government of India keeps asking, what are the Chinese doing there? Why did they bring those two divisions there and mobilize them there? But all kinds of reasons have been given now, whether it's the bifurcation of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, or the buildup of infrastructure on our side, or the fact that China wants to actually get India to kowtow to it, and the fact that it is actually the leading power in Asia, or maybe a combination of all of these, who knows? But I think the moral of the story here is that a lot of our shibboleths about the way we actually expect our adversaries to behave the way we want them to, and we routinely find ourselves surprised, whether it's Kargil in 1999, where you're doing business with the political leadership, not realizing that the military man who's really in command is already moving his brigades to capture territory across the line of control, or in here in the line of actual control, where you believe that because you seem to have engaged with China diplomatically at the very highest levels, that there would not be a military operation of the kind, an offensive, aggressive posturing on the line of actual control, that it actually happened. So the moral of the story, of course, which the book brings out not in that much detail, is the fact that never take your enemies for granted, especially when you're in one of the roughest neighborhoods of the world, which is this triangle of India, Pakistan, and China, where you're faced with what the military calls a two-front war, but which is actually, it's a two-front challenge, and that's been the case since the 1960s, when Pakistan and China came very close together and exchanged territory and nuclear weapons and missiles and what have you. So, like I said earlier, now it remains to be seen if Full Spectrum is going to have a sequel of sorts. Will it be a chapter? Would it be more pages to the reprint? It all depends on what is going to happen next. But as that old saying goes, we're living in interesting times. And I'd really like to thank Arjun sir for writing this book. It's absolutely unputdownable, and thank you for having me over here.
Thank you, Sandeep. Arjun, we'll have we have time for two sets of conversations. So one, Christina and Sandeep have raised some points. You may want to respond to them, and I will also add something here, which perhaps you may want to comment upon, which is the point that I made earlier in the introduction, that one of the themes that runs through this book and perhaps in the larger writing, in the two volumes, is this idea that we somehow have not been able to use our tactical and operational successes for strategic gains. Now, why is that? Is this an institutional problem that we don't have commensurate institutions to manage this transition? Is it a problem, as many people point out, India, there's a strategic culture problem? This is an issue about our strategic culture, the way we manage our strategic threats. Or is it simply a question of civil military relations, or simply a question of political will? What, from your perspective, covering this entire span of these wars in two volumes, what will your assessment be at this point? Over to you.
Okay. Harsh, I think I'll go backwards. I'll first address the question that is freshest in my mind, which is the one from you, and then I'll go back to Christina and Sandeep. I think the Indian strategic establishment very well understands, and the Indian military very well understands, that war and conflict are nothing but an extension of political manifestations, and so therefore political outcomes are always, we've always worked towards political outcomes, and that's the facet of a democracy. But having said that, it's also a DNA issue. It's also a DNA issue that has revolved a lot on this. I've always lamented about it, even when I was a young officer, that there has always been this desire or aspiration to be seen as a responsible and restrained power. And while wanting to be seen as responsible and restrained, we've always ended up being bested on the negotiating table, whether it is in 1965, whether it is in 1971. Even there are reports that say that even in Kargil, an opportunity was lost to straighten the line of control after the Indian Army had made significant progress in July before the ceasefire. But you've got to see political outcomes, and I think this whole desire to be seen as responsible and restrained, while seeming a little delicate at the moment, but if you stretch it over 75 years, I think this policy has stood India in good stead. And you see, now there is a bit of a change. There is a bit of a change that says that, okay, we've been seen for too long to be seen as diffident and excessively restrained. Maybe we are at a cusp, or we are at a turning point wherein the strategic establishment feels that, or not feels, it is already felt and it is already demonstrated that there is a window and that there is a space, and that we have demonstrated some amount of an inclination to move from reactive deterrence to proactive deterrence. And so I don't think, my singular guess is that after the actions of July 31st and 1st August, I don't think we are going to get away from this China fracas without playing hardball on the negotiating table. And you see signs of that by the fact it's never happened before, that the corps commanders, have been involved in every single meeting and for such a prolonged period of time. Never before in negotiations have corps commanders from the Indian military or the army commander been involved in such protracted and extensive negotiations. So I think we are seeing a shift, and I don't think we're going to see the gains of that occupation of the South Bank and the North Bank being frittered away. So Harsh, I hope my sense is that what you're saying may be a thing of the past, and there is a desire and a movement towards being seen as more proactive and more assertive in our approach towards negotiations and conversion of operational gains into strategic outcomes. Now, Christina, I wanted to address this whole issue of jointmanship. Now, you brought out this issue of the term of jointmanship. Now, jointmanship actually originated at the Defence Services Staff College in Wellington. And it's a term that you've pinned on very rightly. Nowhere else is it called jointmanship. And jointmanship is in the mind. It is an attempt to get togetherness in the mind and say that, look, you guys, you've been together from the National Defence Academy. You are again together at the Defence Services Staff College. You're going to come again together at the National Defence College. But for heaven's sake, why don't you convert this togetherness that is visible upfront into something that can be converted into operational outcomes? And that's a work in progress, because for very long in the Indian military, we've looked at things that are joined and not joint. And it is only over the last decade and a half or so that we've really gotten serious about demonstrating jointmanship, which means to say right from the word go, from the time that plans are being put together, you have all the three services working together. Let me give you an example, a classic example, and Sandeep, you will agree with me, that after the June 15th clash in the Galwan Valley up to July 31st, 1st August, a good 2 months plus. Now, the response of 31st July and 1st August could not have been carried out in the manner in which it was unless we were completely prepared for a possible escalation. And that possible escalation was planned for by a concerted logistics movement into Ladakh that was a combination of road and air. Never before has there been so much of fighter flying, armed helicopter and attack helicopter flying seen over Ladakh. I mean, the aviators like me in the past used to say, when are we going to, when are we going to fly over that pristine area? Because it was always a no-no. Don't antagonize the Chinese by going anywhere closer than, say, 15 kilometers from the line of actual control. So I can see a significant shift in jointmanship, answering Christina's question about have we moved forward after Kargil. And I think the 31st July and 1st August operation was also backed by some very good preventive intelligence that came in the Indian Army's way that allowed them to sort of preempt the Chinese to occupying those sites. Now, Sandeep, the one issue that I want to sort of address, which you brought out, is you mentioned that much of war and conflict in contemporary India is influenced by the triangle. And which is why over the last 70 years we see that we've demonstrated an excessively continental mindset towards war fighting, and it's not without reason. We have been primarily faced with continental threats, And the reason why we've been focusing in recent times a lot on maritime capability and air power is because there is an attempt by the strategic establishment to drag that focus away from primarily an animosity-based war-fighting situation to something that also does justice to India's growing influence as a power of consequence. So there is a genuine attempt to pull away from the continental mindset without sort of lowering our guards there. Because now it's not only animosity that has to be tackled with force, but it is also a certain amount of power that has to be demonstrated in expansion of influence. And let's face it, that as India becomes a leading power, it has to have military capability for influence, not only for application in combat. So I think I think that's one thing that I would like to sort of respond to your very interesting issue that you looked at, the triangle that has dictated Indian military preparedness and military responses.
Thank you. Now, unless Christina and Sandeep want to come back, may I take the conversation forward? Okay.
Oh, please do.
So, Arjun, there are 2 points that I would like you to respond to. One is this perennial question. You mentioned, you responded to Christina's point about jointmanship and jointry, how it is progressing. And of course, we now have a CDS has been appointed, so there is an expectation that things are moving in the right direction. But still, there are complaints, and there are always complaints in every armed forces about intra-services issues and how they are tackled. Do you think we have reached a point where these intra-services issues are perhaps not the central issue that we are looking at, or have become a sideshow, and that we have institutional capabilities now to take jointry forward in ways that perhaps increases the confidence in India's ability to project power in the application of power, etc. So I think the larger question about on the jointry front, are we on the right direction? Are we moving in the right direction? Especially with certain structures being put in place. But what more do you foresee happening going forward in terms of doctrinal and other evolution? The other related question that I wanted to raise is that this question often comes when you talk of defense policy, is the question of resources. And every time budget is presented, you have a certain lamentation in the press, or the resources are limited, and of course defense forces also complain, not without reason, that they are not being given enough. But the question is that the argument from the other side is that this is the new normal, that resources have always been difficult to generate, but now as the economic situation goes into a turmoil, as the global economic environment changes, as India's economic situation perhaps becomes not as robust as it was in the past, a resource constraint is going to be an issue, and Indian defense forces will have to deliver within those limited constraints. So when you look at this question of ends, ways, and means, how do you balance them out? Given that this is going to be the sort of a longer-term trajectory as well, and this is going to be a discourse that is going to be with us for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so let me split this up into, for coherence into two parts. The first part is that the guns versus butter argument will continue, and my sense is that if our core national objective and if the Prime Minister's long-term vision is to see India as a fully developed country and a 5 trillion or a 4 trillion economy in a finite time, obviously the struggle between monies for guns and monies for development is always going to be there. And the last argument you made is that I think we are here to stay in an environment which will always involve the armed forces having to play catch up, having to innovate, having to cut their coat according to the cloth that is available, having to do more with less. That is something that you cannot wish away. I mean to say, how much ever Sandeep may write, in India today about the fact that the defense budget is woefully inadequate, I'm afraid that this challenge is something that is going to continue, and the Indian armed forces will have to sort of cope with it. Will have to innovate and make do more with less. But that is no yardstick by which I'm suggesting that capability building must take a back seat. So I think capability development has to continue concurrently. And if I were to put a number on the figure, I think it's time that the defense budget does creep up to beyond the 2 and approaches at least the 2 to 2.5% of GDP. That will give the Indian military some breathing space to tackle threats across the spectrum of conflict. So my only, I would only urge that when you look at allocating monies for the defense budget and for capability building, if there is one thing that is kept in mind, and that is the very, very large spectrum of conflict that the Indian military has to sort of cope with over the next decade or so concurrently, I think only then will that balance will that balance be created. So I think there needs to be an understanding, a better understanding on both sides of not only full spectrum threats, but also what is the long-term, what's the long-term core national objective. The second thing is about tough battles. Tough battles will continue, Harsh. Even the United States military, which reformed extensively after the Goldwater-Nichols Act, still has tremendous amount of tough battles. Whether it is between the Marine Corps and the U.S. Navy, whether it is between the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Marine Corps air element, there is tough battles will exist. So if you think that the new architecture that has been put in place with the CDS at the helm will completely take away tough battles, no. Plus, I think tough battles are important to keep capability building going. To a certain extent, tough battles are important to keep service competencies and service pride together. But how do you sort of make the services work together is what is the challenge that the current architecture has to put in place. And I think from whatever interaction during my interviews with the CDS and the other leadership is that I think everyone is cognizant of the fact that there is no going back from the fact that the architecture will change in the years ahead. The architecture for joint structures will change. The three services have to cope, and that is the message I think that has that rings out. And so I'm hopeful that jointmanship increases significantly. But I think it would be wishful thinking to say that tough battles will vanish. No, they will go on parallelly. They will go on.
So do you foresee theater commands coming into operation anytime soon? Is that where we are going?
The concept note for both the Air Defense Command and the Logistics Command is now circulating amongst the three services. Okay, so I think it is while it's in the air, like they say, love is in the air. Similarly, theater commands are in the air. But for that to be converted into actual structures will, I think, take place once we get a flavor of what the Air Defense Command is going to look like, and what probably the Logistics Command is going to look like, and what some of the other structures are going to look like. What is the likely change to take place in the Andaman Nicobar Command? So it's going to be a building block kind of a process. It's going to be a step-by-step process. So I really don't think I can give you a clear-cut answers whether theater commands are around the corner. They may be in the air. They are certainly in the air. Restructuring, making them leaner and meaner is important. But when they will come about, I think we just have to wait and watch.
Arjun, we are running out of time. I have two final questions for you.
Okay.
One is, this, and again, this comes out from the book itself, is, as a student of conflict and war, how do you see the changing character of war? Where is it going? The changing character of conflict. Do you assess great power rivalry, which is back again in reckoning, to put a halt towards what we were discussing a few years back, more interstate conflicts, more subnational conflicts? Have we halted that momentum because suddenly now great power competition is back in vogue, big power conflict is back in vogue? And how does a nation like India, how does its armed forces prepare for that full spectrum conflict? Again, taking off from your book, because going forward, not looking backwards, but as you pointed out, as we have been discussing, India looking at itself as more of a global player, more of a global power, trying to expand its influence across Indo-Pacific and Eurasia. What should be a reasoned assessment of the changing nature of conflict? And finally, given how closely associated you are with professional military education, I think, to me, as a student of defense studies and military studies, that seems to be one area where we have not done as well as we can, perhaps. Scholar warrior is a term that is often used, but we have very few of them. How do we generate more of them? How do we generate thinking capability in the Indian defense establishment that perhaps prepares new generation leadership in Indian defense forces, which can be more of a strategic leader kind of a profile, given that we have also not seen great progress on the defense university front? So final two questions for you.
Yeah. Again, recency, one is more comfortable with the recency effect. So I'll take the last question first. Okay. Now, I have been witness to the manner in which India's professional military education system has evolved over the last 2.5 decades. Okay, right from the time when I was a faculty member at the Defense Services Staff College, back again with the NDC, and now again back with the NDC as a mentor and as an academic advisor. Once again, my prognosis is absolutely in tune with yours, is that I'm afraid the progress has been slow. And the reason is because I think building intellectual capital in the Indian military has not been given the kind of impetus that it ought to have been given. It's not something, it's something that everyone is aware of. Everyone wants to sort of address. But the sheer load of operational commitments within the Indian military, constantly in operations, actually has hindered the kind of progress that you're looking at. Now, the other question is, and I'll say this with all humility, that I think, I hope I've set an example in the military that it's possible to combine an active professional career with extremely robust and focused academic learning. I retired as a 2-star officer, and I've had the privilege of sort of evolving not only as a practitioner but also as an academic from within the system. Now, I did my PhD while I was within the system. I started my writing. I published my first book from within the system. So I think if we have some enlightened leadership that understands the value that intellectual capital will add to the Indian military in the years going ahead, when a lot of warfare is going to be fought in the mind, I think we will see a sea change. I can only hope that there is a significant improvement, but I go along with you saying that it's been suboptimal and a lot needs to be done. Now, finally, a quick example that till now, we never had any adjunct faculty and mentors in any one of our war colleges. Well, for the last few months, I've been a mentor and an academic advisor at the National Defense College, and I'm also an adjunct faculty at the Naval War College. Now, this was unthinkable 5 years ago. So we are moving in the right direction, but the movement needs to be faster. And the last question is about the changing character of war. I think the span or the spectrum of conflict is only going to get broader. I do not see the shrinking of this spectrum for some time now. And why do I say that? For some time we felt that large interstate conflict was no longer a possibility. That possibility has now been thrown out of the window. You're back again to big power rivalry likely to lead to conflict. What you've also seen is that while one believes that amongst the big powers there is greater amount of nuclear maturity, but there is also this concept that's creeping in which is called all measures short of war. The panoply of possibilities under this umbrella, which is all measures short of war, is going to keep states frightfully busy over the next decade or so. Sandeep, you asked about what's going on with the Chinese. This is precisely what's going on with the Chinese. It is all measures short of war. They will stretch that envelope to the very maximum to avoid conflict. But it will keep them on tenterhooks, it will keep us on the tenterhooks. So Harsh, I think changing character of war, it just becomes more and more elastic with more and more things fused in. You have all measures short of war, you have cyber, you have space, you have information warfare. And all the more reason comes back to that last point that you made. All this leads to the need for more intellectual capital. And I think with that, I think that's what I would sort of offer to your two questions.
And that's an excellent note to end this conversation. We have had an excellent time, Arjun, listening to you, listening to Sandeep and Christina. And hopefully the book will do as well as as its prequel. So good luck to you. And thank you for joining today. Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you, Christina. And thank you all those who joined for this excellent conversation. And more power to Arjun and to other scholar warriors in the making. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Sandeep. And thank you, everyone, for listening.